So welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. I'm Matthew Duchesne, the Chief of the Commission's Office of Native Affairs and Policy. This webinar will have two parts, each lasting approximately 1 hour. In part one, Tom Derringe, the Deputy Chief of the Wireless Telecommunication Bureau's Mobility Division, will provide an introduction to broadband network engineering with an emphasis on networks that make use of spectrum to deliver advanced communications services. Part two will provide an overview of the requirements and obligations placed on FCC spectrum licensees, with a special emphasis on licenses obtained through the Commission's 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal priority window. This presentation will be made by Nadia Sotos-Wallace and Catherine Schrader, attorneys in the Wireless Bureau's Broadband Division. There will be time for questions at the end of each presentation. You may submit questions to livequestions@fcc.gov. If we don't have time to get to all the questions submitted, we'll follow up with people individually. But you should also be aware that the live questions box is only enabled during the webinar itself. If you have questions after the webinar is over, you should submit them to the points of contact identified in each of the presentations. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on the webinar event page of the Commission's website, as well as on the Commission's YouTube channel. Later, the slides used in both presentations will also be posted to the webinar event page. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Derringe to get us started.
Thank you, Matthew. I hope everyone's safe and healthy out there. I thought about wearing a suit for the first time since March for this event today, but given the 2020 we all had and the way 2021 is turning out, I decided to go with the official business attire of Hawaii because we could all use a little aloha right now. Let's go with the next slide, Matthew. We're going to just quick overview. We're going to touch on some basic terminology. Talk really briefly about system architecture because that's not really my area of expertise, but it's good to kind of see it from a big picture perspective. Then we're going to talk about spectrum considerations, and that really is my area of expertise, and regulatory considerations when you're looking at spectrum. And towards the end, we're going to talk about some ongoing proceedings that you may want to follow, and then open that up for questions. Next slide. So what's up with all the G's? When I first started the commission in the early 90s, we just had first generation analog mobile, analog cellular service. And it was at 800 megahertz, and that was the only option out there. And most of the phones were the size of lunch boxes in a sense. But one of the first proceedings I worked on was our PCS proceeding, which introduced the first digital mobile phone, which was second generation. We all remember third generation. That's when we could start, sending things a little more, web content, data, things like that. And those were technologies such as CDMA and GSM and UMTS. Most of us have been on fourth generation and continue on fourth generation for several years now, which is LTE, which stood for long-term evolution. I guess it was not as long-term evolution because we're now moving on to, there's still a lot of 3G and 4G out there. But 4G brought us, pretty good speed on data. We could start watching movies when we're, on the train and doing video conferencing and things like that. So 4G has been really nice. And now the parties have rolled out 5G. And all 5G is the next generation of mobile broadband. I've heard rumors of 6G. I don't know what that is. Maybe we're all going to start communicating telepathically or something. Who knows? But somewhere out there, they may be thinking about that. 5G, though, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about there. The new standard for 5G is called NR, which stands for New Radio, which also explains why you don't put engineers in the marketing department. But I thought LTE was a better acronym, but we now have NR as a new 5G standard, and various companies are rolling it out. And sometimes this whole 5G is a bit of marketing. Like you'll hear Sprint say, "We're the first 5G to be nationwide, and our 5G goes longer." And then you'll hear Verizon say, "Well, our 5G is faster." And there is a little bit of truth in that, in the sense of um, you know Sprint or T-Mobile has decided to roll out their 5G on their 600 megahertz frequencies, which have a longer propagation. And so, yeah, those signals will travel further. They'll have less bandwidth at 600 megahertz. Whereas Verizon, their first, tranche at 5G was to use some of the new frontier bands up in 20 some gigahertz, which is very wide bandwidth in major cities. So those are much higher frequencies. So the signals don't go as far, but you have much wider bandwidths for higher speed. So, there's a lot of marketing when people talk about 5G. Our signal's stronger, our signal goes further, ours is faster. But, it's all basically built upon the NR. And all of the cellular companies also have different spectrum holdings in their war chest. Many of them can deploy the NR standard at any of the spectrum holdings they have. And when they design these standards, they don't do it just for one frequency band. They do it across all frequency bands. And it's really up to the carrier to decide, I'm going to, transition my legacy 3G off of 800 megahertz and start, deploying 5G NR there. So, it comes down to a business decision. What 5G, some of the concepts they're doing is now, the concept of advanced antenna systems like MIMO, multiple input, multiple output antennas. That technology has been out there for a long time, but now, it's going to be more widespread. They're going to do beam forming so that you can send the signal where you want it instead of wasting energy where you don't want it. They're going to do lower power, more frequent cell towers. So, the whole concept of cellular is based upon the concept of reusing the frequency very often. So with 5G, they're coming down into the neighborhood using the higher frequency bands to reuse that frequency very often, allowing more bandwidth so that they can deliver higher speeds. So there's a lot of things that come with the 5G. In addition, the NR standard is building upon the LTE standard to, again, use higher order modulation to deliver faster delivery speeds. And the concept of 5G is now, depending on where you're at, you have all the bandwidth you need so that you can do telemedicine, you can do Internet of Things, you can do machine to machine to connect billions of devices, because they are, increasing the deployment and using a wide range of frequencies, starting as low as 600, going through, I've got a slide later that will go through all the bands that the Commission has made available over the past 2 decades. And you could have 5G services on any of them. So, and for the first time in a long time, we're really pushing up into the upper gigahertz range. It wasn't necessarily cost effective long ago when some companies tried to roll out LMDS and didn't succeed in the marketplace. But now the technology is cheaper, the demand is there, and so the higher gigahertz services make a lot of sense, especially in urban environments where you want to have many cells of lower power to reuse that frequency over and over and over. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is just a broad, simple slide I created a while back to show you that when you're building this broadband network, you really need to think about your audience and how you're going to reach your customers, and what type of topography do you have, what spectrum assets, what fiber assets, things like that. There's no magical solution, but there's a lot of things you have to consider. Starting at who are your customers, what kind of density do they live in, and how are you going to reach them? Because if you want to deliver them cable TV and broadband delivery and all this stuff, then you may be building a fiber network or a coaxial cable system into their neighborhood. If you want to have high-speed mobile service, people expect to have widespread coverage. They don't want the mobile service to drop off when they leave their home or their neighborhood. So you're going to have wide area spectrum to do things like that. It's very economical for some people just to do a wireless internet service provision for a small community. You may have to use satellite to reach some remote entities. There's an infinite amount of technology, bands, and methods to reach your customer and provide a wide range of service. So once you decide who your audience is and the service you want to provide, then you got to figure out what type of backhaul infrastructure am I going to deliver to them. And there's a million options there as well. The commission has bands for fixed point-to-point microwave, which is very economical and covers a lot of things. Are you going to deliver fiber? Do you want to use satellite? There's a lot of ways. Eventually, you need to get to an aggregation point. It's got a lot of different names. They call them gateways, head-ends, data centers, central offices, routing centers. And from there, you've got to connect to the internet exchange points where things go out into the World Wide Web, in a sense. So, this is a very simple slide, but the point of it is, once you figure out who your audience is, there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. So the trick is figuring out which one's most cost-effective, most viable for the type of deployment you want to do. Let's go to the next one. This is another way of looking at that slide from before in a more generic way. You have to consider your access network and design that, and then you got to, have your regional connections and your path to the internet exchange point, and from there it goes to off to the World Wide Web or the data centers and things like that. But we can go and go to the next slide. Some of the things to consider when you're talking about spectrum. Lower frequencies travel further. They have better propagation. So this is an example I gave you earlier about T-Mobile advertising that their 5G goes further. If you're using 600 megahertz licenses, you got excellent propagation, but you also have less bandwidth there. The higher in frequency you go, the longer these signals tend to travel. Higher frequencies tend to bounce off of things. Lower frequencies have a better propagation. They can penetrate through forests and trees and walls and things like that. But both have their advantages. One of the nice things about higher frequencies is they're great for covering short distances, and then you've got a huge amount of spectrum that, a quarter mile away or half mile away, you can deploy another bit of infrastructure to cover a lot of people. So there's a lot of things to consider there. Are you going to providing mobile broadband, or are you going to be serving a fixed location? That will determine the type of technology and the bands you want to look at. You have to consider spectrum availability and cost. Many people in this group may not be trying to compete with Verizon at an auction, but we'll talk about secondary markets a little bit later, where you can purchase spectrum from another licensee, or you can lease it from them. Spectrum in rural areas is generally more available than it is in urban areas, because that's more valuable because you have more customers that you can serve. Equipment availability and cost. I mentioned that earlier, where LMDS came out of the commission many years ago, and everyone said, oh, this is going to be great to deliver broadband, fixed broadband to people's homes. But it failed in the market because there wasn't a high demand for it, and the equipment was not cheap and easy. So, a lot has changed since LMDS, but now, they are pushing into these higher frequency ranges. The equipment is viable. And so, but at the same time, when you're looking at a band, you may want to do a little research on to make sure that you have equipment to support that band. And do you need, when you're looking at the service you want to provide, what is your scope of deployment? We kind of mentioned that. And do you need exclusivity, or can you share the spectrum? So that's going to be a key factor on the type of spectrum you obtain. Want to roll to the next? So just some terminology to understand. We have allocation categories at the commission, and you may hear the term flexible use spectrum. We When we make a flexible use allocation, that generally means it's fixed or mobile, because when you purchase a PCS license or a AWS license or a BRS license, the allocation behind that is fixed and mobile to allow you to use that spectrum flexibly, so that you can provide a mobile service, or you can use it for fixed backhaul, or you can use it for fixed point-to-point. But there's a lot of different allocation categories you can use. And these allocations come with a certain status. If you look at it, 2.106, our table of allocations, services that are capitalized or have primary status, that means they are protected. Or you can have co-primary status between services where they have to coordinate with one another to avoid interference. Some of these bands may have secondary uses, which are permitted in the band, but they have to protect the primary. And then you have unlicensed, which is basically you have no rights to the spectrum. You can use it, but you're not allowed any protection. You just have to get along with your neighbors. The assignment is attaining an authorization for a frequency at a certain location, getting a license. The license and rules typically dictate what frequencies are assigned for what purpose. The geographic scope of your authority will outline technical parameters like power, antenna heights, spurious emission limits. The commission is not really big on telling you the type of technology you're going to use for broadband services. So we learned a long time ago that we're not a command and control type of society, or our regulations are not that way. Some countries are. Some countries will tell you are deploying this technology, and whereas because our rulemaking process often takes years to go through and change our rules, we try to write them as flexibly as possible so that you have the maximum flexibility to deploy technological evolutions as they come out. Occasionally, you will run into instances where our rules are too restrictive to do something, and you have to go through a rulemaking process or seek a waiver. This happens every now and then, and just come talk to us if you discover that situation. Let's go to the next one. This is just a broad picture of the NTIA spectrum allocation chart. It doesn't really tell you a whole lot other than we regulate everything that is non-federal government from 900 kilohertz up to 300 gigahertz. And in the United States, about a third of the spectrum is used exclusively by the federal government, governed by the NTIA. A third is used by us, and a third is shared. And all those details are in 2.106. Let's go next. So when you're getting licensed spectrum, if you're going to do a mobile service or fixed broadband, most likely you're talking about geographic area licensing. That's where we give you a block of spectrum over a defined geographic area. Those geographic areas have changed a lot over the years of the commission. You may have heard of economic areas, basic major economic areas, basic trading blocks, and we've even used counties. So there's a lot of different, depending on the band you're using, we have different geographic limits. And the way our regulations use this, it usually allows you to deploy anywhere in that geographic area in any fashion you want, as long as you meet certain field strength limits at the boundaries so that you don't interfere with your neighbors. They're assigned by auction, but we do have a secondary market process. We do also do coordinated fixed-based licensing. This is fixed backhaul, microwave links, some satellite, and also some narrowband land mobile that public safety uses, but you're not really talking broadband when you're doing that. Most of those channels can be shared or exclusive, but coordination is required to prevent interference. Let's roll next. We'll talk a little bit about license by rule. We license by rules of certain services, and most of them are in Part 95, where Congress gave us authority to, it's not unlicensed, but it's too burdensome to go through an authorization process. So it's shared frequency that everyone gets access to, and there's generally protocols to make sure everyone gets along. So examples of that are the CBRS, which has a licensed and a license by rule component, which is unlicensed, called GAA, General Authorized Access. And in Part 95, you'll see CB radio, family radio service, med radio, radio control. There's a lot of things that are licensed by rule. Unlicensed, there's a lot of unlicensed band, extremely popular. That's what most of your Wi-Fi is. Many WISP are. It's the Unlicensed National Information Infrastructure Band. I wrote those regulations in the 90s. But the uni bands is what people call them, but that's what they originally stood for, uni. And we'll talk a little about some of those few of those bands. Let's go next. If you're looking at land mobile considerations, I touched on some of this already. Understand your customers, your service areas. Does it overlap with, if you're a rural utility providing utility services in certain areas, most likely our spectrum licenses don't match up ideally with your service areas. So you may want to go through a secondary market or get partners to obtaining spectrum, because why obtain spectrum if you have no intentions of serving those areas? Commission does have build-out requirements you have to consider. Spectrum in rural areas is generally more available and less used, so there's a lot of bandwidth in rural areas, but getting access is tough. If you're going to become a wide area mobile provider, you've got 911 obligations you have to meet. There's more power in licensed mobile spectrum. You have interference protection, you have exclusive rights, generally, and so you have more certainty than you would with unlicensed. The license terms are generally 5 or 10 years with an expectation of renewal if you've built out your system adequately and you've acted, as a good licensee and kept it operating and things like that. If anyone has problems with that or questions about that, we can address that elsewhere. Your regulatory requirements are your construction requirements, renewal requirements, 911 and others. You also have to keep your ULS records up to date. I'll give you some nightmare scenarios of this. Bob, was the spectrum manager for a company. And so Bob got all the notifications from the FCC when it was time to file his build-out requirements or when it was time to renew his license. Bob retires or passes away, sadly, so those emails go unread. Now your license goes into automatic termination and no one gets notice of it. Now your license is dead and you didn't, and there's nothing you can do about it. So when you're dealing with licensing and for licensed spectrum, consider setting up an account that gets checked by multiple people regularly, maybe, or just kind of, there's a lot of companies or law firms out there that will manage your licenses for you. That's part of their business and their service. But holding a license, you do have obligations to keep things up to date, update your contact information, and make sure that your license stays in good standing. Let's go to the next one. Secondary markets are a great concept the Commission has put a lot of time and thought into. And it basically means we've made it as easy as possible for people that do not participate in an auction to obtain spectrum, or people that do participate in an auction and have spectrum that they don't want to use or they want to lease out to do it. It's fairly, there are some, I'm not an attorney, but there are some evaluations that have to do with anti-competitive behavior that get reviewed, but generally the license transfer process is fairly flexible and easy unless you're doing some significant merger activity. Leasing, other licensee, if you lease spectrum, the other licensee still owns the license, but you get to negotiate access to that under terms that you find agreeable. The one caution of leasing is the licensee must keep that licensing in good standing. If Bob retired and the person you're leasing the spectrum on gets their license terminated, you don't have much control over that. So anyway, let's go to the next slide. Partitioning is breaking off a geographic area of a license. Again, we're very flexible on this. You get a large rural area in New Mexico and your rural utility, maybe consider going in with a consortium of other rural utilities to get a larger license, and each of you either partition it out to have it, each of you have your own portion, or you manage it as a consortium. We do not usually reaggregate licenses back together, just a heads up. People have tried that in the past. It's been very difficult. But also, if you go, be mindful of the size of spectrum you get, because you still have to meet our construction requirements. So you don't want to get something so big that you can't meet the minimum requirements. You don't want to get something so small that you can't meet the license boundary requirements and also provide adequate service. Disaggregation is breaking off a portion of your bandwidth. If you have a 20 megahertz license and you only need 10 of it, you can sell 10 to someone else. You can partition and disaggregate in the same transaction. So we've given as much flexibility here as we can. Next slide. Fixed spectrum considerations. A lot of people don't give the fixed point-to-point service its due diligence, but I think, especially in New Mexico, when you have these beautiful open desert lands and mountain ranges and things like that, it can be very difficult at times to run fiber optic cable through a mountain or over a mountain. But fixed point-to-point is very reliable. The fee structure is not horrible. Application fees, this last I checked, around 300. Coordination fees are 500 or 600. It's scalable. You can obtain 30 megahertz channels, or 2 or 3, but there are some standards, I believe, on using the spectrum and efficiency standards. So you can't just grab all the fixed channels, not use them. You can get lengths of 20 to 30 miles quite often. And also you can lease capacity on existing paths. You've got your local fire department or public safety entity may own its own point-to-point link or something like that, and they may be able to lease you space on their facilities, because why build a brand new tower for the same purpose? I mentioned earlier about Verizon doing their 5G in the Spectrum Frontier bands. So you're seeing a lot of fixed point-to-multipoint services. This is licensed, fixed, up in the 24 gigahertz range. Very high bandwidth for last mile communications. And then the technology is finally rolling out there. So this is now a cost-effective alternative for people to consider if you're trying to cover a small community. Or if you're trying to cover a dense urban environment and you want to reuse the frequency very often. And let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. License-free consideration. So it is quite common for small companies to start their own wireless internet service provision service. They get the backhaul they need, or they run fiber to a community and it's a small community, and they just put up a WISP and use unlicensed. And this is perfectly fine. The problem is these unlicensed bands are quite often shared with government radar systems. So if you're next to a government base in New Mexico, I know there are some there, you may want to be careful about using unlicensed for your service. Baby monitors, garage door openers, everybody, cordless phones, are all in unlicensed bands. So, it's just the chance you take. It's great technology. No protection rights. The power limits are low so that we can reuse the frequencies over and over and over. But the rules are really flexible, and there's few regulatory obstacles. You go buy it, you plug it in a sense. Part 15 contains all of our unlicensed rules. You can do fixed links that can achieve lengths of several miles. I don't know the exact, I've heard numbers like 10 miles, but I don't know personally. You can do up to 1 watt with varying antenna gains, depending on which band you're operating in. So, there's quite a bit you can do in part 15 as far as the last couple of blocks, as well as, long fixed links. TV white spaces, I've got a slide on this below because there's a lot happening in that band. Which some of it may make a lot of sense for rural New Mexico, but we'll touch on that in a little bit. Let's go next slide. Another benefit of the unlicensed bands are the equipment's really affordable. And and we just made some new, I would call it not unlicensed, but it's license-free, license like the CBRS band at 35 or 3550 to 3700. The bottom portion of that band were auctioned off for priority access licenses. And the top portion of the band, they reserve for general authorized access, which is unlicensed. You do have to pay a spectrum manager to access that band. But the way they set up the CBRS, they actually made it so that GAA can use any of the band until any part of the band until priority access needs it. And but there's still a portion of reserve for that. And this is kind of one of the new bands that they were very excited about for 5G deployment in urban areas and in rural areas as well. And so this is a possibility you guys should look at. And for the first time, it's dynamic spectrum management through a spectrum management system. So there was a very interesting proceeding where they designed this to share with government radar systems and satellite facilities. And that's what the spectrum manager does. Basically, when you register your device, it says, where are you? Okay, here are the best channels for you to use in that area. And there's also unlicensed band up in Spectrum Frontiers bands as well for short hops in very wide bandwidth. Let's go next slide. So we recently completed a proceeding on TV white spaces in Part 15. There's the docket there if you want to read it, FCC 2156. Expands the eligibility of white space devices to deliver broadband services. And it broke it out to less congested areas where it would allow fixed and mobile power up to 16 watts, as well as higher antenna heights. So 16 watts in a rural area is pretty significant, especially if you can get some antenna height on it there. There's a lot of excitement about TV white spaces in rural areas because there's not a lot of TVs in those spaces. Some of the limitations you still have to work around is you got to avoid the existing TV stations, and there's also some microwave options in there. The propagation is very good in these VHF, UHF frequency, VHF ranges. License free, and the channels are generally available in rural areas. So take a look at TV white spaces. I believe Microsoft has been putting a lot of research into this, and there's other companies out there too trying to develop equipment for this license-free option. Next slide. Oh yeah, so this is just a sample of some of the band plans. One of the interesting things about NR and LTE was like this as well. The commission used to allot frequencies in pairs. You had a base transmit and a mobile transmit, and corresponding base receive, mobile receive. So the bottom one there is an example of the 700 megahertz band where we transitioned a bunch of TV channels for broadband. And you'll see an A block paired with an A block, a B block paired with a B block. Whereas at 2.5 with the BRS, it's not paired necessarily. It's just spectrum chunks. The nice thing about the newer technologies is depending on what frequency you have, the technology can be configured to operate either in a FDD mode, frequency division duplexing, where you operate on one frequency is the base transmit, the other one's the mobile transmit, or you can operate TDD, where basically time division duplexing, where the mobile device and the base station share the same time, share the same channel, but divided in time. So this is just an example that when you're looking at different bands, we've configured them various ways over the past 3 decades. So there's varying sizes of spectrums from 6 megahertz up to 30 megahertz blocks. And then through the secondary market transactions, people have taken a lot of those 30 megahertz blocks and broken them into smaller blocks. So there's a lot of variation out there, and look at that. But luckily, technology has evolved such that the LTE and the NR standards, you can order the equipment that operates at very narrow frequencies all the way up to 20 megahertz wide frequencies. Generally, the reason they're doing wider frequencies on some of these frequencies is the wider the bandwidth of the channel, the more efficient the throughput. That doesn't mean that you can't do a lot with a 5 megahertz NR channel. But anyway, I'll move on to the next slide. This is another band plan sample. This is for the CBRS band that we recently auctioned off the priority access in the lower portion in 10 megahertz blocks. This is going to be a TDD type configuration. And you see also in the upper portion where it's going to be the general authorized access for anyone can operate once you go through the spectrum manager. And above that, at 3.7, we're currently going with our auction for the new 3.7 gigahertz service, which I think it's the highest grossing auction we've ever had. So that's still ongoing. Next slide. There's a lot on here. I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail. Just you can keep it in your back pocket when you're starting to explore spectrum options. You've heard me talk about 600, 700 cellular, PCS, AWS. We've got a rulemaking going on right now to explore new mid-band spectrum at 345 to 35. I mentioned the CBRS, that's out there now, able to be used at 3.5. We just completed a new 280 megahertz at the 3.7 gigahertz service. We've made a ton of spectrum available up in the 20-some gigahertz and higher, for short range, very wide bandwidth. And the commission continues to work. So you look at this, we've made a lot of spectrum available. And a lot of this is unused in rural areas. So it's just a matter of figuring out how you're going to get your hands on it. On the unlicensed side, we've made tons of spectrum available there as well. And the commission continues to work on it. You'll see, again, the lower the frequency down to 900 megahertz, people sometimes use that for fixed point-to-point. Most of your Wi-Fi uses the 5 gigahertz uni and 2.4. And there's other higher frequency bands as well. And you got the TV white spaces. We've got a rulemaking right now looking at repurposing the 5.9 gigahertz band, expanding uni up there, exploring how to share the 6 gigahertz band with fixed. And there's some new unlicensed bands up around 64 gigahertz. So again, a lot of options. It really comes down to who you're trying to serve, what type of footprint you're under. Let's go next slide. Some ongoing rulemakings or things to watch for. I've kind of talked fast. We'll have a lot of time for questions at the end. CBRS is rolling out. I'm excited to see how well the spectrum management works on that and see those equipment happen. So the priority access license were auctioned, but the GAA is available once you pay the fee. You can do private LTE networks, you can do mobile, you can do last mile fixed. There's a lot going on there. I mentioned the TV white spaces, some of the ongoing proceedings that you can participate in. Well, it's the proceeding that's still going to participate in is 3.45. And the docket 18-295 on new unlicensed uses at 6 gigahertz. I don't think that's been finalized yet, so that's still ongoing. The auction is ongoing for the 3.7 gigahertz service. There are some recons to resolve there, but there's always some new spectrum coming available or some flexibility being arranged through some of these. Let's go to the next slide. I wanted to talk briefly about our universal licensing system. It can probably be a little intimidating and even frustrating to me at times because there's so much in this thing and there's so much power there. But if you're a rural entity and you're interested in spectrum, but you don't want to go through auction, you want to do the secondary markets, sometimes it's hardest just to know who to contact. So there are ways that you can go into our licensing database and you can do a geo search, and you can say, I want to look at all 600, 700 cellular licensees in Mercer County, West Virginia, for example. And you go through there and you click the services you're interested in. You can click active regular licenses, and then you go to the bottom of the page and you hit geo search, and then you specify the state and the county, and ULS will pop up all the licensees. You want to go to the next slide? And this is the next stage where you can pick the location. And go to the next slide. And it'll spit out something looking like this. And here's all the call signs for all the licensees in that county on the service that you specified. It doesn't have to be service. Services is an easy way. When I say service like CW is cellular. So you can click on CW and it'll bring up all the cellular licensees in that county. You can also specify a frequency range in ULS. So I want to find all licensees operating in the 600 to 700 megahertz range or something like that, and we'll just bring them up. And if you click on these licenses over to the left there, all of these licenses have a contact information. Now, this is not always the regional director of this license. Sometimes it may be the regulatory office in Washington, but it's a contact. You can also see who's leasing spectrum in that county on that frequency. Like you'll see here that one of these is a T-Mobile. It's got a leasing application on it, so you can see that T-Mobile is doing leasing there. Maybe T-Mobile will lease you some spectrum as well. So if you need help with ULS, or if you need help where you can't see licensee won't talk to you, call us. We'll try to be helpful if we can. We can't make any of these people do a negotiation or partition spectrum or lease you spectrum, but we can put you in contact with the right people to talk to, perhaps. I have connected people with the appropriate spectrum managers for corporations just to do the introduction, and that's about all we can do. It's up to them whether they want to pursue a secondary market transaction with you. But at least you're armed with information now. Who are the area. Maybe you just want to find out if they got infrastructure you can lease on their fiber or their fixed backhaul or something like that. There's a lot of, when you're covering rural areas, there's not a lot of money, and you spend a lot of money on infrastructure. So forming consortiums and partnerships to share the cost is always a good thing. So next slide. That's pretty much it. You can call us. You can email me. I will say that the people in our Native Affairs office are really try hard to help you. I would try them first because quite often they've answered that question before. And when they don't know the answer, sometimes they know who to call within the commission to answer a question. So every now and then I'll get a call from one of the attorneys over there and say, Tom, we've got someone that's having an issue with this. Can you help, or do you know who we can help? And so you have a good advocate at the commission to help you find the information you need. And I guess with that, we'll open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. Do we have questions for Tom that have come in?
We have not received any questions. So far.
I'm sorry, I think you said nothing has come in so far, right?
That's right.
Okay. Well, everybody has Tom's contact information here, his email at least. And as he mentioned, you're always welcome to reach out to the Office of Native Affairs and Policy. We have a web page or a website on the Commission's website with all of our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to us. And as Tom said, when we don't know the answer, we can help you find the people who do. But Tom, with that, I think we're going to let you go, and we'll turn it over for the licensee obligations and responsibilities presentation by Nadia and Catherine. Thank you very much, Tom.
Take care, everyone.
Okay, so hello, this is Nadia Sotos-Wallace, and I'm going to be doing this presentation with Catherine Schrader. We are both attorneys in the Broadband division of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and I'm sure many of you that are on the line have probably spoken to us or emailed with us at some point through this process, through the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window process. Matthew, if you want to move to the introduction slide, please. The overview slide. So these are the items we're going to discuss today. There will be a little bit of overlap, excuse me, with what Tom discussed. We do hope to have some question and answer time at the end. one thing I did want to mention is that if you have questions about your specific application or your specific license, we would recommend that you send an email to ruraltribalwindow@fcc.gov, and we will reach out to you directly. If we don't get to all the questions, we will also respond via email. So even if we don't have time, please make sure you get your questions in, and we will do our very best to answer them either during at the end of the presentation or in the future. So I also wanted to note that we are in the licensing division at the FCC. So the content of our portion of this webinar is going to be focused on licensing questions with a specific focus on the 2.5 rural tribal window licenses. I also want to note that the rural tribal window and the spectrum that's being assigned there is a very unique opportunity. It's a very unique licensing process. So some of the things that Tom mentioned that are a little bit more universally true may not necessarily apply to the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window spectrum. We can go to the next slide. So as a way of introduction, we want to note that FCC licensees must comply both with the FCC regulations and specific conditions contained on their licenses. The rules and conditions include operational, technical, and administrative requirements. Rules, and we will be discussing specifically later on some of these specific conditions and some of the specific rules. Licensees are responsible for knowing the applicable rules and staying on top of rule changes. I don't know, I didn't know is never an excuse before the FCC. So it really is important for licensees to understand the rules, look at the rules, and ask questions if you don't understand. For the 2.5 gigahertz licensees, we have a site here in the slide where you can go and find the actual FCC rules. What's most important for 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal licensees are parts 1 and parts 27. I'm now going to turn it over to Catherine to speak briefly about the build-out requirements that apply with specific emphasis again on the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window licensees.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Catherine Schrader. As Nadia said, I'll be talking to you about build-out. Matthew, you can go to the next slide, please. So build-out requirements that you may also sometimes hear referred to as construction requirements are various different build-out requirements apply to most spectrum licenses issued by the Commission. They vary by service. And the basic idea is that licensees must construct and operate a system using their licensed spectrum, the spectrum that's covered by that specific license, at the specified minimum level for their service within a specified period in order to retain and renew that license. The specific rules section for the build-out requirements for the tribal licenses, these licenses issued out of the rural tribal priority window in 2.5 gigahertz, we have the rule citation here for you if you'd like to go and look at that yourself. But the basics of this are, there's an interim deadline 2 years after the license grant, and then a final deadline 5 years after the license grant. And here I want to take a moment to emphasize this clock starts running when your particular license is granted. So first of all, we are in the midst of processing all these applications that came in through the window. We have granted some licenses already. We are still processing others. So if you are still waiting on your application to be processed, this clock has not yet started for you. It will start when it is granted, but it hasn't started yet for everyone. And so along with that, you are going to need to, each individual licensee is going to need to be mindful of these specific build-out deadlines for your license, because it will not be the same as every other tribal license. And Matthew, you can go ahead and advance the slide, please. So here is what the requirements specifically are. At the 2-year deadline, licenses will need to have, you will need to have built out your license so that your network either covers 50% of the population, and by coverage, we mean is able to provide service to 50% of the population. This does not mean that 50% of the population in your license area is actually signed up for the service. It just means that you have a base station or other network coverage that could provide service to 50% of the population if they signed up. In the alternative, and that would be for mobile or point-to-multipoint services, something where you put up a base station in the middle and it is capable of connecting to equipment within a certain range. For fixed point-to-point links, point A to point B transmissions, the requirement is 1 link per 50,000 population in the license area on the interim deadline, meaning if you have fewer than 50,000 people, you need 1 link. For the final 5-year requirement, that requirement is 80% population coverage. Again, that means ability to sign up, not necessarily that 80% of people are connected. Or if you're using fixed point-to-point links, 1 link per 25,000 in the license area. So if you have fewer than 25,000 people, that is still 1 link. Now, everything, the equipment that you're using to fulfill these build-out requirements does need to be in use and part of a network that is actually providing service. So it can't just be 1 link put up to transmit to itself in isolation. It does need to be part of a bona fide operating network. Now, if the interim license requirement is not met on time, then the final deadline accelerates to 4 years after the license grant. So please be aware of that. And in terms of filing paperwork for this, licensees must file a construction notification on Form 601 within 15 days of the relevant deadline, 2 years after, and then 4 or 5 years after as applicable. We are not going to go in today. We're not going to go into the specifics of exactly how to file that construction notification. We anticipate providing further guidance to licensees closer to once those first construction deadlines for the first license grants start approaching. But we do want to make you aware right now that that is a paperwork requirement that will exist once that time rolls around for your license. And again, that's a date that's going to be specific to each individual license based on the date it was granted. It is not a service-wide date for all rural tribal licensees. And with that, I think Matthew can go to the next slide. That concludes the build-out portion. Yes, I'll turn it back over to Nadia.
Thanks, Catherine. So let's start with talking about license conditions. So license conditions are restrictions that are placed on specific licenses. So you know, they are not something that would be contained in our rules. They will be found on the license themselves. And these are in addition to whatever regulations exist in Part 27 and Part 1 of the FCC's rules that apply to all licenses in a band or a service. In order to find the specific license conditions that are applicable to your particular license, you would look in the Commission's Universal Licensing System Database, ULS, under the Admin tab, and there you would be able to find your license conditions. In addition, if you print out a hard copy of your license, also available through ULS, you would be able to see what conditions apply. I'm now going to discuss specifically certain conditions that might be appearing on your 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window license. So briefly, there's and this applies to all, the first one applies to all licenses. There is a prohibition on operating in areas and on frequencies subject to an incumbent license. So if there was an existing 2.5 gigahertz license, that covers some of the frequencies or some of the area for which your license was granted, you are prohibited from providing service in those areas. And that particular condition will be found on every license granted through the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window. And then we have three potential international coordination conditions that you might find. Um, so there are two that apply if you're within a certain distance of the Canadian border, one that would apply if you're within 120 kilometers of the Canadian border, and one that would apply if you're within 120 to 160 kilometers of the Canadian border. And then we have an additional international coordination condition that would apply if your license is within 80 kilometers of the Mexican border. Matthew, we can advance the slides. So with respect to the first of these three conditions, which is the condition that applies to all licenses granted in the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window, as our rulemaking and our order discussed, these licenses, the rural tribal window licenses, are considered overlay licenses, which means they may overlap with the existing incumbents that have had licenses in the 2.5 gigahertz band for some time. The incumbent licensee retains the right to operate under the terms of its license unless and until that license is canceled, terminated, or expired. New tribal licensees are not permitted to operate on any channels in any area where those channels are licensed to the incumbent. Information on the specifics can be found in, if you're looking to see where the incumbents are, you can look in the Commission's mapping tool in the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window webpage. If that incumbent license is canceled, terminated, or expired, then the new tribal overlay license would automatically acquire the right to operate in that previously overlapped area. And just by way of noting, if in your application that you filed within the window, you requested particular channels for which there is no available spectrum, those channels would be excluded when your license was granted. So for instance, if you applied for channels 1, 2, and 3, and there was absolutely no available spectrum on channel 3, your license would only include channels 1 and 2, even if you requested channel 3. Although, despite the fact that you are prohibited from operating in areas that are held by an incumbent 2.5 gigahertz licensee, you will have the opportunity to attempt to negotiate with them if you'd like to try to work something out. As Tom mentioned earlier, incumbent contact information can be found in the Commission's Universal Licensing System database. And again, as Tom mentioned, the Commission can point you to the right people, we can point you to the right information, but we will not assist with negotiations, nor can we mediate or arbitrate with respect to such negotiations. That is the responsibility of the entity trying to acquire rights to spectrum. We can move on, Matthew. Okay, so a little bit of specifics with respect to the Canadian coordination conditions. So the 2.5 gigahertz Canadian coordination requirements apply in two cases. The first one is if a tribal licensee is within 120 kilometers of the border. If they're within 120 kilometers of the border, then they must comply with the current US-Canadian coordination requirements before operating. If they're within if the rural tribal window licensee is within 120 and 160 kilometers from the border, there are still requirements that you need to comply with. You will know if these Canadian coordination requirements apply to you because you will see those conditions on your license. You will also see those conditions in ULS. We anticipate sometime in the near future sending a letter to licensees who are impacted by these Canadian coordination obligations, but licensees should note that the obligations apply whether or not you actually receive that letter. And like I mentioned, the license as granted notes the specific coordination condition that applies to you. We can move. Next slide, please. So this slide, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but this is the current agreement that the US and Canada have. Note that these are not requirements that apply only to tribal licensees. These are requirements that apply across the board to any licensee in the 2.5 gigahertz band. So this is the current agreement. The interim arrangement concerning the use of the frequency bands 2150 to 2162. I'm not going to go through the whole name, but we also, on this slide, there is a link so that if you want to go ahead and look at the agreement yourself and figure out what it's all about, you can link there and find the agreement. In addition, it's important to note that 2.5 gigahertz licensees are bound by any future US-Canada agreements concerning the band. So if at some point in the future we enter into an updated agreement, these licenses are still obligated to comply with that agreement, whatever that may be. If you'd like to look at some further information, we have a rule site here to 47 CFR 1.928, which further describes affected areas and frequencies. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So this is Mexican coordination. The Mexican coordination obligation applies if a rural tribal window or other 2.5 gigahertz licensee is within 80 kilometers of the Mexican border. Again, this obligation, the compliance must happen before the rural tribal window licensee starts to operate. So you would want to make sure that you've looked at the agreement, spoken to FCC staff if need be, to make sure that you understand what this means and what's required of you. Again, we do anticipate in the near future sending out a letter to all 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window licensees that will be impacted by Mexican coordination, but the obligations apply whether or not you've received that letter. If you note on your license that there is a specific coordination condition that applies. Next slide, please. This slide just notes the agreement that currently exists between the US and Mexico. And there's, again, a link to the agreement and a note that 2.5 gigahertz licensees are bound by any future US-Mexico agreements concerning this band. So again, I just want to note that with respect to the various conditions, the first condition that prohibits operation on frequencies and in areas previously licensed and held by current 2.5 gigahertz incumbents, that applies across the board to every new license in the 2.5 gigahertz band, including the rural tribal window licensees. The Mexican and Canadian coordination conditions, you will note those on your license if they apply to you, and you will, in the near future, receive a letter from is out with a little bit more detail what the process is and what will be required. And in the meantime, like with everything in the rural tribal window, if you have questions or if you need additional information, please feel free to email us at ruraltribalwindow@fcc.gov. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Matthew. Okay, now that we have discussed the specific conditions that might appear on licenses that are specific to those particular licenses, I wanted to talk a little bit about the rules, the 2.5 gigahertz rules. So, yeah, to remind licensees that it is your obligation, licensee, before the FCC to um, understand and acknowledge and know what the rules are and ensure that the license, when you begin deployment and operation, that you are in compliance with those rules. Again, note that these rules are not tribal specific. They do not apply only to the licenses granted through the rural tribal window, but they apply to all licenses in the 2.5 gigahertz band, whether tribal, whether commercial, whether educational. We're gonna focus mostly on two particular technical and operational rules here. Both have to do with interference issues. Both were briefly touched on by Tom. There are other, like I mentioned, you want to familiarize yourself with all of the rules, and I did want to point out two rules that I would recommend that you look at um, and get to understand, which are those with respect to power limits and emission limits. And those sites are right there. Power limits is 47 CFR 27.50 subparagraph H, and the emission limits are 47 CFR section 27.53 subparagraph M. But what we're going to focus on now are the power strength limits at the border and then interference protection. So Matthew, let's move on to the next slide, which is power strength limits at the border. So both of these rules are technical rules that exist to protect licensees from interference. This is exclusive use spectrum, and we want to make sure that everyone who has a license can use those licenses and is not causing interference or receiving interference. So power strength limits at the border. This particular rule, which again is 27.55A subparagraph 4, this rule indicates what the power limits are at the border of a license area. So for most tribes who are getting licenses that would be within their reservation boundaries, this rule indicates what power you can use at those reservation edges so that you do not cause interference to someone that might hold a license that is adjacent to you. So in general terms, what this means is a licensee can operate, a licensee has to operate within a certain power to comply with the rules. But our rules also allow, generally, that a licensee can operate at a greater power if there is no adjacent market operator, which means that if there's no one there, if you operate at a greater power, you wouldn't be causing anybody interference. But at that point in time, when an adjacent market operator deploys, you then are required to come into compliance with those power strength limits at the border. So that is certainly something to consider when you are constructing and deploying your network, to note that if someone comes in next door, you may be required under our rules to lower your power at the border if you do not operate within those compliance limits. Again, we allow agreements to allow you to come out of compliance as long as both the tribe and the adjacent market operator agree to allow you to come out of compliance, and then you would have to comply with whatever the terms of that agreement is. And if there is no agreement, you are required, once there is an adjacent market operator, to comply with the power strength limits at the border. If you'd like to, I would suggest taking a look at that rule. Again, the site is right there on that page, 47 CFR 27.55 A4, and you can see what those limits are. And again, if you have questions, feel free to send us an email at ruraltribalwindow@fcc.gov, and we will do our best to assist you. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the interference protection rules. There are a variety of interference protection rules that the FCC has adopted. I'm going to talk specifically about the one that applies to the 2.5 gigahertz band. Again, this does not apply only to rural tribal licensees, but applies to all licensees in the 2.5 gigahertz band. So interference protection for licensees in the 2.5 gigahertz band stations is based on two things: the height of the antenna and the distance between the antenna and another operator's base station. Our rules do not indicate a limit on what the antenna height should be, but depending on what that height is, that is what determines whether a base station gets interference protection or not. So if a base station complies with the applicable antenna height benchmarking limits, then even if they cause interference to an adjacent market operator, they're not required to do anything. They're not required to reduce their power. But if you are not in compliance with antenna height benchmarking, then upon notification from that adjacent market operator, you would be required to reduce your power to come into compliance. And it's the combination of the height of the antenna, the distance from the second operator's base station, and what equipment you're using. There are a lot of things that go into this antenna height benchmarking determination. There's a lot of things that you need to look at to determine whether or not you are in compliance with these rules. So again, I would emphatically recommend that you take a look at 27.1221. That rule and that language there lays out the various technical specifications, the process requirements, and what the applicable height benchmarking limits are, depending on the height of your antenna, the distance to the base station, and a variety of other technical considerations that go into this, into considering interference protection. One second. Okay. Now I want to talk briefly about administrative updates. I want to note again that Tom did mention this. The information that licensees provided to us in their applications when they filed within the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window, whatever contact information that was provided, that's the information that appears currently in the Commission's Universal Licensing System database. That is the information that is considered official. So if we need to contact you for any reason, that is the information we are going to use. If we have to send a letter, or if we need to call you, or if we need to email you, we are going to use the information that's in the database. If we are unable to contact you because the information in the database has not been updated, that is your problem. You need to make sure that you update that information when it changes. All you need to do is go into the Universal Licensing System database. There is a particular filing that you can do that's called an administrative update. And in that update, you can do things like change names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, basic contact information. All it is an administrative update. Our rules at 47 CFR section 1.5 obligate licensees to keep this information updated. And again, I just want to note what Tom said. As a lawyer, both inside the commission and outside the commission, this particular rule, if licensees don't keep this information current, it can be a problem. I mean, I have worked with licensees who didn't keep this information current and weren't made aware that they didn't file a renewal application and that their license was being canceled. So you definitely want to keep that information updated. It is very important. In addition, you want to make sure that your ownership information is kept updated. All the applicants in the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window had to file an FCC Form 602 ownership disclosure form. That information for the tribes wasn't particularly a difficult process. Tribes were required to notify us of their tribal council members' names and a contact address. Our rules at section 1.919 require that if that information changes, you need to let us know. So for instance, if there's a major change to your tribal council, you should file a new FCC Form 602. With respect to both the administrative update and the ownership information update, there's no fee. It's not a filing that goes on public notice that needs to be granted. It's just a filing that you are required to do so that your records at the FCC are current. Okay, let's move on, Matthew. So let's talk about renewal applications for a minute. I mean, this may seem a little bit futuristic since the licenses in the 2.5 gigahertz band have a 10-year term, so this isn't something anyone's going to be focused on right now. But it is something to be aware of because it is something you are going to want to think about as you're deploying service and using the spectrum that your license has given you the right to use. So a renewal application must be filed in ULS. Again, all applications filed with the FCC need to be filed electronically in the Universal Licensing System database. It must be filed on or before the license expiration date. As Catherine noted when she was discussing the performance requirements, that date will be different for each license because it's based on the date the license was granted. It would be 10 years after that. So a licensee that holds more than one license may even have two different expiration dates for those licenses. It really just depends on when the license is granted. So when you file your renewal application, you would have to include an attachment, and that attachment essentially will be a demonstration that over the license term, the licensee has provided and continues to provide service to the public in accordance with their final performance requirements, as Catherine noted before, or has operated and continues to operate the license to meet the license's private internal communication needs per the final performance requirements. Now, whether you're providing service to the public or whether you're using the license to meet private internal needs is what determines which type of showing you're going to make. I'll discuss in a minute the different safe harbors that exist for the renewal applications that will get you the renewal expectancy that Tom mentioned in his presentation. Very important to note that a licensee that does not make an adequate renewal showing, for instance, if you were to file the application and not include the attachment, or if you were not to demonstrate to us that you are still meeting your performance requirements, those applications will be denied and the underlying license will be canceled. With respect to renewal applications, there are a number of rules that you want to keep in mind, and those are all listed here on the slide. Some of them have to do with process, and some of them have to do with the requirements of the application. Let's move on. So I'm going to discuss the safe harbors very briefly. So your first renewal safe harbor, which means at your first expiration date in 10 years, you're going to be required to demonstrate that you've met both the initial interim and final performance requirements, which would be what Catherine was talking about earlier. So, you want to make sure you meet those 2 and 4 year requirements. Renewals after that first 10-year term, so for example, your second or third 10-year term, you have to demonstrate that you are continuing to provide service meeting or exceeding those final performance requirements. So again, you're going to want to include an attachment describing what the license is being used for and how it's being used in a way that either meets or exceeds how you met your final performance requirements. Those are the 2 safe harbors. So at the 10-year and then at 20 and beyond, if you are continuing to meet your final performance requirements, then you can expect a renewal expectancy. If you cannot meet one of those safe harbors because something has changed in the meantime, there isn't one additional way that you can make an alternative showing of the service being provided. Those are evaluated on a case-by-case basis. There is a substantial amount of information that you would want to provide. Those will be analyzed on a case-by-case basis, and we may come back to you for additional information depending on what you've provided to us. Obviously, your best bet is to go and meet the safe harbors. Okay, let's move on. Okay. Assignments. So licenses can be assigned, but for the 2.5 gigahertz rural tribal window licenses, those licenses cannot be assigned unless and until a licensee's interim and final performance requirements have been met, the construction notifications filed and approved by the FCC. So at that point, after construction notifications have been filed and approved, rural tribal window licensee does have the ability to assign its license to a third party. Assignments require FCC approval. In most cases, the approval must be given before the consummation of that transaction. If a license is assigned to a third party, an assignment application must be filed again in the Commission's Universal Licensing System database. It's an application that would be a process between both the current licensee and the assignee, the third party who will be taking assignment of the license. And the FCC will consider and process that application. Those licenses, the assignment application will be granted. Then, upon grant of the assignment application, then the parties, the current licensee and the future licensee, can consummate the transaction. And then at that point, the new licensee would be required to make an additional filing in the Universal Licensing System database, which would, they would have to file a consummation notice, which is when the new licensee files telling us what date that the assignment was consummated. Now, we cite to the rule here, you'd want to look at 47 CFR 1.948 for more information about assignments. Now, there is one type of assignment application that generally does not need prior approval, and that would be a pro forma assignment. And a pro forma assignment is essentially when the form of ownership changes, but the actual control stays with the same entity. So, for example, um, generally I have seen pro forma assignments with corporate entities. So, a couple of examples might be if an entity changes from a limited liability corporation to a corporation, then that could be considered a pro forma. Or if a license is held by a parent company and they create a new subsidiary company and they want the license held by the subsidiary, that would be considered pro forma, because while the actual form of the ownership is changing, the ultimate control is staying with the same company, with the same entity. Okay, let's move on to leases. Okay, so 2.5 gigahertz spectrum licenses can be leased in whole or in part at any time once the license has been granted. Over the last couple of months through this process, we have received a number of questions about leasing and about the leasing process, so we wanted to make sure and discuss that today. FCC approval is required for all leases. However, what must be filed and when it must be filed depends on what kind of lease the parties are entering into. For some of the types of leases, prior FCC approval may be required. Just by example, the FCC does have short-term leases, long-term leases. Then we also have what's known as a de facto lease or a spectrum manager lease. I think the short and long-term are pretty obvious. A short-term lease would be a year or less. A long-term would be something longer than that. De facto and spectrum manager have to do with who retains control over the license, who manages the network, and who's responsible for compliance with FCC rules. We would highly suggest that you take a look at 47 CFR section 1.9001 and the rules that follow that for a discussion of the different types of leases, the different process depending on what kind of lease you're interested in entering into, and when those lease applications need to be filed. Like an assignment application, the approval process for a lease requires an application filed in the Commission's Universal Licensing System database, and it's an application that moves back and forth between the lessor or licensee and the lessee who's going to lease the spectrum. Okay, let's move on. We're nearing the end here, and we should have plenty of time for questions. Discontinuance. So once you have a license and once you have met your performance requirements, you have an obligation to use that license and to continue using that license. If you permanently discontinue service or operations, your license will be automatically terminated by the FCC. Permanent discontinuance is defined as 180 consecutive days during which a licensee does not operate or provide service to at least one subscriber. We look at permanent discontinuance starting on at that point when the licensee is required to be providing service or operating. So the 180 days would start counting from that point. And again, the authorization automatically terminates without specific action by the FCC if a license permanently discontinues operation. There's a rule site here, 47 CFR section 1.953. If a licensee has gone 180 days, but they have every expectation that they are going to come back on and continue to provide, restart their service, then you can get an extension of that discontinuance period. you must file an application 30 days before the end of that 180 days. You must justify that application. Essentially, you need to give us good cause. Tell us what happened. If you had some examples that I have seen in the past. If there was a hurricane or some weather disaster, that caused your equipment to go down, and it's taking you that long, but you're working on it and you're going to get there. That that might very well give us the good cause we need to give you an extension of that 180-day period. Again, the extension request must be filed at least 30 days before the end of that discontinuance period. And if you do file it, it would automatically extend the discontinuance period for a minimum of 30 days, or at that point when the Bureau acts on the request for discontinuance. Okay, last slide. So I just wanted to thank everybody for their time. I know we've provided a lot of information in a short amount of time. As Matthew noted at the beginning, we will be making these slides available. In addition, if you have questions, most of you have contacted us through the Rural Tribal Window at fcc.gov email address, but please feel free. We check that email address on a regular basis and do our very best to respond as expeditiously as possible. I also wanted to remind everybody here of where you can find the rules that we cited throughout this presentation in parts 1 and parts 27. You can find them at www.ecfr.gov. So with that, I guess we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and thank you, Catherine. Do we have questions come in for either of them?
We do. So we'll start out. We had some questions on build-out requirements, and specifically about how those requirements would be documented, what type of method could be used, for example, to show meeting or exceeding those requirements, such as heat maps showing coverage, number of customers, network topology maps, etc.
Thanks, Susan. I'll take that one. So just as a reminder for everyone, we do anticipate providing more detailed information as we get closer to the first construction build-out requirement deadlines about precisely how to document that information and how to fill out and submit the relevant form. But just as some basic answers to that question, when licensees fill out the form, their construction notification form, they provide information on their network deployments and coverage with technical details. It's essentially a documentation of what equipment they've deployed and what its characteristics are. And our engineers review the filings to make sure that it meets that the network meets the construction requirements. So licensees have to show that they are providing service, but we don't require any sort of customer information. As I said, the construction requirements are based on the service you are capable of providing to customers and not on how many customers have actually connected. So I hope that answers that question. And if anyone has specific questions about their particular situation, please email the Rural Tribal Window mailbox and we will do our best to help you out.
Thanks, Catherine. We also have one other general question about how tribes can identify incumbent licensee information, such as the rights when their licenses expire, etc.
Okay, I'll take that one. This is Nadia. So I think I mentioned during the presentation, incumbent information can be found in the Commission's Universal Licensing System database. So you would want to start with looking at the FCC's mapping tool. And using the mapping tool, you can determine which licenses, what the incumbent licenses are. And then by using that mapping tool, you would come up with the call signs, and then you can plug those call signs into the Commission's Universal Licensing System database, and it would provide you with the contact information that those licensees have provided to the FCC. And that would also give you license expiration dates. It would tell you whether or not the spectrum was already being leased to somebody. It would give you a variety of information by looking at the Universal Licensing System database file for a particular call sign. And again, we can help you navigate that. We can't help you negotiate the incumbent issue, but we can help you figure out how to use ULS to find the information that you're looking for.
Thanks, Naja. The only other questions that we've received were kind of more specific, applicant-specific applications. So just a reminder, if anyone is interested in learning more about the status of their pending application, that they should email us at the Rural Tribal Window at fcc.gov box.
Okay, and it sounds like we are done for the day. I want to thank the presenters, Nadia, Catherine, and Tom, for their time and for very helpful presentations. I want to thank everybody who participated and just encourage you to reach out to us if we can help in any way. So I hope everybody has a good day. Thank you.